Throughout the Milky Way, it is nearly impossible to find a human being who can boast of the absence of even a single scar on their body. And these are merely humans with their fleeting lives, the duration of which on the timeline appears as a brief flash. What then can be said of a galaxy whose age counts in the tens of billions of years? Over such a long existence, the Milky Way simply could not avoid bearing the marks left by its histories. These marks are like an autograph, reminding us of events from long-forgotten days. And one of the most striking among them is the Eye of Terror, which has been spilling unrelenting etheric energies into real space for many thousands of years. Contrary to popular belief, the history of the Eye of Terror can be traced back to the events of the War in Heaven. Even in those ancient times, through the use of some technology of incredible potency, the ancient race managed to breach the fabric of reality precisely at the location where the eye now exists. Only through enormous efforts were the Necrons able to mend this tear in the unseen barrier between reality and the immaterium, doing so by means of a mysterious technology known in the Imperium as pylons. The soulless conquerors placed their blackstone installations around the perimeter of the breach, thus causing it to involute. To prevent similar phenomena in the future, they went further, installing their pylons across the galaxy in specific locations. The logic behind the Necrons' choice of these locations was only understood by the Imperium in the 42nd millennium. Imperial scholars discovered that the boundary between reality and the warp is particularly thin in areas with the densest star clusters. From this, conclusions followed that the emergence of the Eye of Terror and other breaches, such as the Maelstrom or the Malacta, occurred in non-random locations, as previously thought. The Great Rift, which split the galaxy, only strengthened the scholars' assumptions. This knowledge also helped predict the actions of the Horned Ones, who attempted to artificially enlarge the Great Rift to sever another part from the Imperium Sanctus. Only through great effort were the Loyalist forces able to disrupt the enemy's plans. However, this also brought the bitter realization that Abaddon's Black Crusades were not as haphazard as previously believed. They aimed at devastating worlds where the pylons might hinder the appearance of the Great Rift. Had the Imperium deciphered the enemy's plans earlier, perhaps the tragedy could have been averted. Unfortunately, humanity is now left to heroically overcome the consequences of its short-sightedness. But it is not only humans who are to blame for what occurred. The first stone in the foundation of the event was laid by the Eldar, whose excesses caused the Eye of Terror to reopen after millions of years of dormancy. Their downfall and embrace of vice brought it about. Being an extremely psychically active race, they caused immense disturbances in the warp. Drop by drop, trickle by trickle, the reflections of the Eldar's vices in the warp began to merge into one. For several thousand years, a tumultuous vortex of the most perverse and disdainful desires, emotions, and feelings took shape within the empires. The moment it would reach its critical point was merely a matter of time. Although still slumbering, Slaanesh continued to draw power from the bottomless well of Eldar's excess, lust, and vanity. Slaanesh already had enough strength to begin influencing the minds of its progenitors, inflaming within them the flames of depraved desires even more intensely, aiming to push them to the brink of destruction as swiftly as possible. This resulted in the creation of cults of pleasure and various methods dedicated to satisfying base needs. And then came the moment when numerous Eldar worlds simultaneously plunged into an especially turbulent orgy, giving Slaanesh enough power to awaken. This marked a truly black hour for this ancient race. The otherworldly horror fully realized itself as a deity, signaling its awakening with a scream that shook the already decrepit barrier built by the Necrons over millions of years. Having lost most of its pylons due to various cataclysms, it simply could not withstand the impact force and collapsed under the furious onslaught of warp energy. What remained was a sad memory in the form of the Cadian Gate, created by the surviving pylons on that planet. For the next several thousand years, they were destined to become the only passage into this merciless storm. a wound in the fabric of the galaxy reopened, flooding everything around with the unrestrained energies of the immaterium, like blood spurting from a severed artery. In an instant, the tendrils of the warp consumed the Eldar worlds located at the epicenter of the blast, erasing them from reality. The souls of those unfortunate enough to be on them became food to sate the insatiable hunger of she who thirsts. But not all of the Eldar Empire perished at once. Those worlds far enough from the blast's epicenter managed to survive it. However, soon the survivors began to envy the dead. One of the brightest examples is the former Eldar world called Melisandre. It was one of the last to feel the power of the spreading energy of the Eye. Now it is dead and desolate. Yet a little over 10,000 years ago, it was a magnificent planet covered with a web of Eldar cities featuring their refined, delicate and incredibly intricate architecture, considered impossible according to human notions of engineering and physics. But everything changed overnight. In the sky, clouds whirled in a dance. Day and night flickered, merging into a grey shimmer. Purple swirls spread across the heavens, thickening, branching, twisting, and staining the air with a red mist. The planet's surface was rent by hellish heat. One by one, the spires began to collapse. They fell to the ground, burying under themselves crowds of slender figures. Thunderclouds gathered into a menacing spiral, enveloping the land in darkness up to the horizon. As the first drops of rain fell from the sky, scorching the skin and reeking strongly of metal, after a single clap of thunder, the heavens split open and crimson particles began to descend, drenching the ruined city with gore. Soon, creatures began to rise from the puddles that had formed in the streets. They staggered and twitched, all different, unnaturally half-formed. In mere moments, the first monsters capable of moving began to hunt for the souls, flesh, and blood of the few survivors. Shortly after, new towers began to slowly rise above the city's ruins. These were slender spires with pulsating walls of living flesh, adorned with mute faces and flayed hands jutting outward. The rising towers grew as if driven by the panic of the Eldar, sprawling through the streets, using their bodies as building material and the flesh of the bloodthirsty monsters as binding mortar. On other fringe worlds, similar, if not more horrific and vile, events were taking place. Thus perished the great empire of the Eldar. And so, for 12 millennia, the Eye has been glaring in the galactic northwest. Throughout this period, the warp storm surrounding the rift in space has not quieted by a single iota. Countless worlds have fallen prey to this dreadful phenomenon, now forever doomed to be the mindless playthings of their careless masters, known as the forces of chaos. What lies beyond the veil of the storm in the Imperium is known to very few. Human speculations are built on the fragments of information gathered by the rare participants of expeditions somehow miraculously returned from extremely perilous journeys. No one can confidently claim the reliability of these fortunate trailblazers, though, for there is no guarantee that the person has not become a puppet of the cunning demons who spared his life only to sow discord with his semi-truthful discoveries among the faithful followers of the Emperor. According to estimates by Imperial researchers, the diameter of the Eye of Terror spans up to 20,000 light-years. Unfortunately, the Imperium holds no maps of this part of the galaxy from before the warp storm's emergence to even estimate the approximate number of star systems ensnared by the anomaly. According to the astropaths, it may hold thousands of systems corrupted and depraved by chaos. The very space between the systems is a mix of reality and the warp energies that permeate it, and the closer a traveler gets to the center of the warp storm, the fewer signs of real space they encounter. Essentially moving into the Eye, a ship transitions into the warp without engaging the warp drive. But this feature also allows the entities of chaos to exist within the anomaly without needing to find a material form. The energies pouring out from the breach in space created by the warp alter the laws of physics that operate in real space. Within the Eye of Terror, the usual passage of time is absent. There, even the very concept of time is scarcely applicable to objects within it. Precisely due to this peculiarity, The Horus Heresy and the Siege of Terra are ancient events, 10 millennia in the past for all humanity. Yet for the Chaos Space Marines, memories of those dark times remain vivid, as if they occurred only recently. Everything within the Eye of Terror is inconsistent and unpredictable, even for its inhabitants. This makes navigation within this anomaly virtually impossible. For instance, even the Chaos Space Marines themselves, when setting out on a journey, do not aim to reach a specific destination, but entrust their fate to the turbulent currents of the warp, which decide where to direct them. Sometimes these voyages end with an emergence into real space far beyond the boundaries of the Eye of Terror. Humanity became aware of this anomaly at the dawn of the Imperium. However, it held little interest for people as it was far from the borders of the young human state. The massive warp storm was simply named Cygnus X1, and no attempts were made to uncover its secrets. But everything changed as Imperial forces approached the anomaly closely, and the first to reach its borders were the Astartes from the Wordbearers Legion. Additionally, they were the first representatives of the Imperium to visit Cadia, then an unknown world not even part of the human state, located on the very edge of the warp storm. Even as they neared the planet, Lorgar's expeditionary fleet began to feel the influence of the strong, unknown anomaly. Even in the surrounding areas, the frenzied whirlwind caused disturbances, forming small warp storms in which the expedition lost 3 large ships. But this could not deter Aurelian, who pressed on toward Cadia, driven by an unknown force. Even the warnings of the chief astropath, who claimed that the anomaly was not just an ordinary warp storm, did not dissuade the Primarch. Particularly disturbing to him was the fact that both he and his aides constantly heard screaming voices emanating from within. However, this too did not convince the Primarch to abandon his idea of pressing forward. Though no witnesses of that conversation, nor records of it remain, aside from notes written much later by Lorgar himself. One reminder of that meeting still exists in the Imperium to this day. It was then that part of the newly discovered space near the Eye of Terror was named the Scarus Sector by the Primarch of the 17th Legion in honor of one of the Wordbearer captains who perished in a warp storm en route to Cadia. 10,000 years have passed since then, and this sector still bears the name of an officer from the Legion that betrayed the Emperor. From Lorgar's records, one can also judge what the Astartes led by Aral Tal saw as they ventured into the Eye of Terror. They were the first witnesses of the Imperium to enter this anomaly. The scene that unfolded before them was beyond imagination. In no other part of the cosmos had they seen such incredible landscapes, and as it turned out later, each of them saw their own individual visions. According to the explanation of the demon accompanying them, named Ingethel, this happened because the form of the raging torrent of energy outside the ship was molded by the consciousness of the observer. Thus, Argal Tal saw images of constantly changing screaming faces resembling ghosts, which hurled themselves against the Geller field, unsuccessfully trying to penetrate the ship. Against the background of all this, torrents of colours and shades swirled, indescribable, continuously flowing and merging into one another. All this was accompanied by the groans of the ship's structures, barely withstanding the impacts of the energy streams playing with the vessel. At that moment, the majestic imperial ship, Song of Orpheus, more closely resembled a splinter, driven by some absurd coincidence into a massive storm. All this was accompanied by the eloquent declamations of Ingethel, searching for cracks in the souls of the warriors clad in the mightiest ceramite armor, whose spiritual armor had already begun to show the first signs of cracking. These cracks were precisely what the ancient entity of the warp exploited. Ingethel knew that to capture a human mind, he first needed to ensnare the soul. Thus, by playing with their emotions and feelings, skillfully mixing falsehood with truth, he achieved his goal. Blinded by his eloquence, the Astartes destroyed the Geller field generator, after which the entire mortal crew fell victim to demonic invasion almost instantly, while the Space Marines themselves were attacked by Ingethel. However, this was not the end of the story for Argal Tal and his warriors. Within moments, they came to life again. Having just died, each of them felt that now they shared their body with someone else, although they did not fully realize it yet. The rest of the ship's crew were desiccated corpses, drained of every last drop of blood. Thus began their drift. Finding that all supplies aboard the ship was spoiled, the Space Marines were forced to resort to cannibalism, first using the crew's corpses and then the blood of the most unfortunate among the Astartes. Only after 7 months did their ship emerge from the Eye of Terror, straight into Lorga's fleet, before the Primarch stood only a few dozen emaciated Astartes, faintly reminiscent of the formidable force they had once been. Thus, the first Gal Vorbak were born. Of course, it is not possible to call the Word-Bearers' penetration into the Eye of Terror a true expedition, since their primary goal was to find the gods of chaos there, rather than to explore this region of space. But it must be acknowledged that the Astartes of the 17th Legion were the first to traverse the path through the Cadian Gate, opening the only stable passage into the Eye of Terror. This expedition by Lorgar's legionnaires was carried out in secrecy from the rest of the Imperium, and thus did not provoke a surge of interest among humanity. At that moment, humanity knew only that ships entering there did not return. Most likely, the first grain of knowledge about what occurs within the Eye of Terror was acquired by humanity through the warriors of the Shattered Legions, who pursued the Emperor's children and Perturabo's legions that ventured into the Eye of Terror in search of the mythical weapon known as the Angel Exterminatus. Although at that time this was already extremely risky, Perturabo trusted Fulgrim, as he promised a weapon with which victory in the war could be achieved. Fortunately, this was not the only reason the Primarch of the 4th Legion decided to undertake such a perilous journey. Perturabo had since childhood felt a mysterious call from the gigantic warp storm. He had heeded it all his life, which led him to the boundaries of this anomaly. In those distant times, it still bore its first name, Cygnus X1. In the Primarch's opinion, it did not match the glory and beauty of this warp rift. Enchanted by what he saw, Perturabo gave it a new, more appropriate name in his view, the Eye of Terror. The objective of the expedition was located in the very heart of the warp storm. Hence the traitors could not reach it alone. This became possible thanks to an Eldar guide. He directed them through the calm currents of warp energy. This allowed them to pass through the storm with almost no losses, except for a space battle with a ship of the warriors of the Shattered Legions. One way or another, both the traitors and their pursuers were guided through the calm currents of immaterium energy, which helped them separately reach the ancient Eldar planet called Idris. It was located in the very center of the Eye of Terror, essentially on the edge of reality itself, orbiting a supermassive black hole whose dimensions defied comprehension. In its devastatingly dark, impenetrable core, light, matter, and even time itself vanished. But contrary to this, due to some unknown forces, unnatural streams of energy flowed from it into real space. The planet, for some inexplicable reasons, remained in place despite the immense forces pulling everything else into the black hole. Although the planet's shape, position, and initial surface scans led to doubts in Perturabo, he decided not to waste time and begin preparing for landing. According to the Iron Warrior strategy, the landing zone was generously seeded with orbital bombardments. The Primarch's objective was accomplished within a few hours. The area within a 3-kilometer radius of the landing site was turned into a scorched field. Then followed a massive landing and fortification of positions on the planet. Fulgrim expressed displeasure about his brother's overly thorough approach, who intended to spend time constructing not just 1 but 2 fortified camps. But Perturabo was adamant, and the Primarch of the Emperor's children had to concede, despite the fact that the Phoenician was eager to enter the Eldar temple. Only when everything was ready did Perturabo give his consent to proceed. Throughout the journey, the Primarch of the Iron Warriors was plagued with doubts about his brother's sincerity. These doubts were fueled by the state of what the 3rd Legion had become. It was no longer an army, but a mob of vandals taking pleasure in the destruction of the magnificent Eldar buildings and in self-inflicted pain. These emotions reached their zenith in the enormous labyrinth that blocked the way to the temple's center. Through a simple ruse, Perturabo realized that the Eldar guide had never been to this place, and that it was all a foolish masquerade orchestrated by his brother. Killing the Xenos, the Primarch of the Iron Warriors attempted to extract the truth from Fulgrim. The Lord of the Emperor's Children decided not to deny and told his brother the truth, or rather, the part of it that was to his advantage. Thanks to his cunning, he managed to conceal the main point and compel Perturabo to continue. The true goal of the Phoenicians' venture was almost within reach when the group reached the main hall of the temple. Madness began to unfold on the surface. The warrior of the Third Legion, Julius Caesaron, unleashed a massacre among his own brothers. It did not last long, but it was sufficient for the blood of nearly 3,000 Emperor's children, spilled on the ground to awaken the souls of the deceased Eldar, and their numbers on the planet were innumerable, as soon became clear. This planet was a kind of massive tomb for an entire race. One by one, the soul stones began to show signs of life. Very soon, the warriors remaining outside and those who had entered the temple were drawn into a grim battle, in which the humans had almost no chance. Unlike Perturabo, Fulgrim did not join the fight, but disappeared into a passage leading underground. The Primarch of the Fourth Legion, following his brother, found him deep below near a gigantic energy sphere that replaced the planet's core. It was here that the final act of betrayal was to take place. The corrupted Primarch of the Third Legion had fallen so low that he was willing to sacrifice his own brother just to elevate himself as an earthly prince. Naturally, Perturabo was not ready to surrender without a fight. However, his strength left him, which was also due to Fulgrim's treachery. The brooch gifted by his brother bore an unusual stone that siphoned Perturabo's power. Everything would have gone according to the Phoenicians' plan. But then warriors from the split legions intervened, disrupting his scheme. To the attacking phantom traitors and Eldar constructs, the loyalists joined, desperately attempting to thwart the enemy's plans. Although they too were unaware of the true objective of the campaign, they almost succeeded in disrupting Fulgrim. But at the last moment, instead of Perturabo's forces, which slipped right from his hands, he sacrificed the souls of all the Eldar resting on the planet for Slaanesh. This was sufficient, and he bestowed Fulgrim with the desired power. There, after a deadly blow from his brother, he was reborn into the monstrosity he remains today. Thanks to his new powers, the Phoenician, along with his warriors, escaped from the planet, abandoning his brother and his sons to perish. Deprived of the soul tomb, it also lost the forces that kept it at a distance from the black hole. The surface, made of psychobone, began to disintegrate, and the world itself slowly started to drift towards the black hole. But even this was not the end of the Eye of Terror's involvement in the events of the Horus Heresy. After their defeat, the forces of the traitors began to rapidly retreat from their occupied positions under the pressure of the loyalist armies. This campaign in the Imperium would later be called the Great Purge. Unable to oppose the righteous, fury-filled forces loyal to the Emperor, the legions that sided with Horus could not find a secure refuge. There simply were no such places within the Imperium. This forced them to flee to the only region of the galaxy where Imperial vengeance could not reach them, the Eye of Terror, where the entities of chaos awaited them with open arms, ready to hand over any world at their disposal suitable for the traitors. All this only to lure more Astartes from the renegades to their side. Thus, Fulgrim, the Primarch of the Emperor's Children, received from Slaanesh an entire world of infinite pleasures, hidden deep within the Eye of Terror, not only from the Imperial Inquisition and loyal Astartes, but also from his own children. Legends say that there reigns depravity and horror, the scale of which is difficult to imagine even for those from the Third Legion who have seen much. For many millennia, they themselves tried to find their father's abode, but none of their attempts succeeded. Without the strong hand of their Primarch, the Legion of the Emperor's Children fragmented into numerous bands. indulging in vile pleasures throughout the Eye of Terror, and raiding beyond its borders only for new slaves and resources to continue their dreadful revelries. Unlike their brothers from the Third Legion, the Iron Warriors initially maintained some semblance of order, which allowed them to capture a planet in the Eye of Terror that became their new home. They named it Medard. The planet's landscape consists of ridges of fortress walls and artificial mountains of impregnable citadels. But all this is only the tip of the iceberg. The main fortifications, consisting of tens of thousands of tunnels and passages, connect countless strongholds in the very heart of the planet. All fortifications of the world are divided into control zones belonging to the warsmiths and are controlled by their great companies. The greatest fortress on the planet belongs to Perturabo himself. There are also descriptions of Medard as a colossal fortress, world where fortifications are interspersed with slave pits and towering columns reaching high into the heavens. Illuminating this grim picture is a black sun casting its dark rays from a snow-white sky. Descriptions of this and several other planets surfaced in the Imperium thanks to the expedition of Inquisitor Maul, which he undertook into the Eye of Terror in the 38th millennium. Alas, this journey shattered his sanity, and upon his return, the Inquisitor was found on his ship utterly deranged. However, every bulkhead of his vessel was covered with writings recounting what he had seen, and they were made with the Inquisitor's own blood. Unfortunately, neither Maul's records nor the testimonies of other explorers contain any information about the world inhabited by the Night Lords. The situation with the Alpha Legion is similar to that of the Night Lords. Even before the Horus Heresy, the activities of the 20th Legion remained shrouded in mystery. Even then, no one could definitively say which planet was home to the legionaries of Alpharius. Now, tracking their activities is even more difficult, although rumors suggest that Alpha legionaries control an entire network of bases spreading not only across worlds in the Eye of Terror, but also on planets within. Imperial space, the world inhabited by the World Eaters, has not been discovered either. But at least it is known that their legion was scattered across the Eye of Terror after the events that occurred on Scalathrax. This information, combined with the lack of centralized command from Angron over his legion, suggests that the World Eaters do not have a homeworld in the Eye of Terror at all. Much more is known about the worlds that have become home to the Word-Bearers, the Thousand Sons, the Death Guard, and the Sons of Horus. The first of these have established themselves on the planet Sicarus. This is a world where, under a horizon the color of blood and fire, temples crowd together like a gigantic throng of religious fanatics, each trying to reach the relics of the saint displayed for worship. And the temples continue to be built. For 10,000 years on Sicarus, there has not been a single patch of land that has not been built upon with a temple or monument dedicated to the ruinous powers. When it became impossible to construct temple complexes outward, the construction went upward, piling new temples on top of existing ones. This massive construction led to most of the world's buildings becoming underground, creating a dark labyrinth where every detail extols chaos. The center of the world is the Basilica of the Word, a colossal fortress where the Dark Council of Dark Apostles gathers, ruling Sicarus in the name of Lorgar. The Basilica is a massive stronghold crowned with hundreds of sharp spires, covered with enormous spikes, on which countless living sacrifices to the dark gods are impaled. Lorgar himself resides in a structure known as the Templum in Fio. For a lengthy period, he remains unseen even by his sons, sustaining a constant meditation by the will of the Chaos Forces. Another legion that found a home in the Eye of Terror is the Thousand Sons Legion. They now inhabit a demon world known as the Planet of the Sorcerers, also called Sortiarius. This world was gifted to Magnus by Tzeentch after a pact was concluded. The Primarch of the 15th Legion was even allowed to teleport his beloved city of Tizca there through the warp as it burned under the attacks of the Space Wolves. This allowed the preservation of much of the manuscripts, which contained the knowledge accumulated by the Primarch and his children throughout the galaxy. Sortiarius is a hostile world to its inhabitants, even by the standards of the Eye of Terror. Dark, rocky, and volcanic, it often suffers from climatic changes associated with tectonic processes and the volcanic eruptions they cause. Instead of a sky, a fierce fire roars overhead, mingling with the streams of warp energy that invade the planet. And instead of atmospheric precipitation, a maddening, terror-filled, mournful, and agonizing howl pours onto the ground, emitted by a choir of lost souls. It apparently originates from a ring similar to the rings of Saturn from the solar system. However, these rings are not made of ice and rock, but of the souls of those who fell victim to Tzeentch's treacherous deceit and are now doomed to eternally whirl in the stream along with other tormented souls like themselves. The city transported by Magnus is more of a mocking parody than the Tizca once called the City of Light. Gloomy, towers emerge from rocky and lava plains, long having lost all their sheen and splendor. Among them wander tens of thousands of slaves captured by the Legionnaires, freely coexisting with their distant kin, mutant beasts who appeared on the planet under the influence of the warp. At the center of this dark city rises an obsidian monolith known as the Tower of the Cyclops. This is the abode of Magnus himself. The tower is crowned with an enormous glowing eye watching over the planet. But if desired, it can peer beyond its borders, even into real space. This helps the Crimson King to see whatever he wishes, including not only the present, but also the future. Another inhospitable world that became a home for Chaos Space Marines is the Plague Planet. Here, disease is the norm, and thus everything on it is permeated with death. Every drop of water, every breath of air teems with deadly pathogens, and only constant prayers to good old Grandfather Nurgle can alleviate the endless agony that the local inhabitants call life. Yet they scuttle across the planet's surface like maggots in a decaying corpse, fighting each other and trying to earn gifts from the plague god. Mortarion has shaped the new home of his legion to resemble his former home world, barbarous, as closely as possible. It is strewn with tall mountains, the peaks of which are surrounded by relatively clean air. Here resides the local aristocracy, the Plague Marines. The highest mountain belongs to the Primarch, while common mortals eke out their meagre existence at the mountain's foot, allowed to ascend only to serve their masters. The planet itself is close to the fabric of real space. This proximity allows the warriors of the Death Guard to conduct raids on worlds of the Imperium, bringing back rich spoils. The planet's orbit is congested with countless vessels. All of them once fell victim to Nurgle's plague, embarking on a long odyssey through the warp, which always ended near the Plague Planet, where they became part of the Plague Fleet. The Sons of Horus chose the planet Malium for themselves. By then, the mighty Legion had reduced to mere remnants, held together only by one common task, the construction of a sepulchre for their fallen genetic father. Gloomy Malium, whose steel surface was rusted and littered with the bones of warp dragons, was a perfect fit for this endeavor. And to ensure that no one dared disturb the eternal sleep of the warrior after his interment, the legionaries began erecting a fortress around the tomb. Its grim structures were made from the wreckage of lost ships, whose desolate hulls had once been adrift in the warp. Each spire, each tower, was essentially the delicate prow of a vessel from the distant past. These were destined to serve one final duty: safeguarding the most crucial relic of the Sons of Horus. The sepulchre was the heart of the fortress. Its walls inside were adorned with narratives and images depicting the deeds of Horus Lupercal. The Primarch himself seemed to hover in stasis, silently observing his worshipping sons. Yet he could no longer protect them from the hordes of demons coveting their souls. This was a plight faced by all the Traitor Legions. Some, like the Emperor's children, immediately embraced them. Others, like the Iron Warriors, sought to preserve their traditions. The Sons of Horus followed a path similar to that of the Fourth Legion. Giving preference to none of the gods, they began to worship undivided chaos alongside their father. Without any overarching goal, they conducted minor raids on other demon worlds and nearby human colonies. However, The onset of a major war between the legions was a matter of time. The gods of chaos were too eager to pit their new playthings against each other, making them significant pieces on the vast chessboard of the great game, which has been played out for eternity. The battles and wars that transpired were so immense and ferocious that their echoes reached even the Imperium, where this conflict was termed the War of the Legions. This conflict marked the definitive collapse of unity among the chaos-corrupted Space Marine legions, who had once fought under the banner of Horus, Lupercal during the heresy, although many events of this conflict remain unclear or distorted by Imperial chroniclers due to the difficulty of obtaining information about the actions of the Traitor Legions within the Eye of Terror. Nevertheless, information about certain events has been preserved. The first strike of the war in the Eye was delivered by the Emperor's children. This was due to the fact that, owing to their excesses, the slaves and supplies captured on Terra and on their way to the Eye of Terror were exhausted faster than those of the other legions. To replenish their shortage, the corrupted followers of Slaanesh could think of nothing better than to start raiding their former battle comrades. One of the events known to the Imperium that occurred during these conflicts was the Battle of Scalathrax. The battle began as a clash between the Emperor's children and the World Eaters, but gradually evolved into a bloody melee raging within the ranks of the 12th Legion. In this conflict, Kharn turned his weapon against his brethren, who refused to cease fighting despite the deadly cold of Scalathrax's night. He set the shelters ablaze, compelling the Astartes of the World Eaters to desperately combat each other for the few remaining safe havens. These actions by Kharn forever splintered the World Eaters' Legion into separate factions. Simultaneously, hundreds of other battles raged within the Eye of Terror. Freed from the bonds of honor and brotherly camaraderie, Astartes tore at each other's throats, fighting for every scrap of territory and shedding hundreds of gallons of blood, even for the most insignificant resources. The sons of Horus tried to stay out of the escalating conflict, but realized that an invasion of Malium by their former allies was only a matter of time. Thus, they hastily prepared, attempting to erect as many fortifications for their fortress and recruit as many warriors as possible. Their only hope was that they could fortify themselves to such a degree that an attack on their positions would not be worth the resources the enemy might gain from a successful siege. But in reality, all of this was self-deception. The 16th Legion possessed too valuable a trophy, the body of Horus Lupercal, and such a prize was worth any loss for the forces of the traitors. And so, using the element of surprise, the Emperor's children, leading the united traitor armies, launched an invasion of Malium. This attack caught the sons of Horus off guard, allowing the numerously superior forces of the 3rd Legion to break through the defenders of the fortress's central quarters with minimal losses. It was there that the decisive battle of this engagement unfolded. Dozens of perverted warriors fell at the hands of the sons of Horus. Yet the power of the attackers was immense, as they had forged enough devilish pacts with Slaanesh to ensure unmatched might. Laughing and howling with unrestrained pleasure, the sons of Fulgrim, along with squads of malignant demonettes, unleashed a bloody massacre. They destroyed their former allies with particular cruelty, severing the limbs of the Space Marines and slicing flesh from their bones. All this led to many hopeless sons of Horus, in their desperation, agreeing to the terms of the otherworldly forces, opening their bodies and minds to demonic entities. Dozens of warriors fell agonizingly as the energies of the Immaterium surged into their bodies, and the souls of the fallen soldiers perished forever, turning them into grotesque warp spawn that barely resembled one of the Emperor's greatest creations. But this did not grant the defenders a decisive advantage. Unfortunately for the sons of Horus, the enemy was too numerous, and even the desperate sacrifices of the legionaries did not tilt the scales in their favor, turning the defensive battle into a struggle for survival. The 16th Legion nearly ceased to exist in that massacre, and already demoralized warriors received a severe blow to their morale when the Emperor's children reached the sanctum of the fortress and the stasis vaults where the body of their beloved Primarch was kept. As soon as the Emperor's children seized the corpse of the former war master. They immediately retreated, taking numerous trophies with them. The enemy fled, leaving behind the lifeless bodies of the sons of Horus and the ruins of the once magnificent fortress. But the black streak for the sons of Horus did not end there. Sometime later, news reached them that the Emperor's children had stolen Horus's body to create copies of it. This endeavor was undertaken by the notorious apothecary of the Third Legion, Fabius Bile. However, this vile attempt to resurrect the power of the traitorous legions resulted in complete failure. Each subsequent clone born from the decaying remains of the once great warrior was even more repulsive than the last. Subsequently, Abaddon managed to rally the surviving sons of Horus, destroy the remains of his Primarch, and dismantle the main fortress of the Emperor's children. This contributed to the ultimate dissolution of the Third Legion and their defeat in the conflict, which can be considered the end of the War of the Legions. At the same time, the sons of Horus were reborn from the ashes as the Black Legion, which within a couple of hundred years would breach the borders of the Imperium and unleash a calamity on a scale unseen since the Horus heresy, later called the First Black Crusade. However, in the Imperium, interest in the Eye of Terror grew even before the beginning of the Black Crusades. The mere retreat of the Traitor Legions to that region heightened the potential danger emanating from this part of the galaxy, and while this region was previously avoided, the Imperium began to fortify its borders around the Warp Storm Zone. The Eye of Terror is separated from the rest of the Imperium by a sort of quarantine cordon, which includes a large number of sectors and subsectors. The most well-known among them are Bellis Corona, Agrippinaea, Scarus, and the Cadian sector. Though this notoriety is ill-famed, they remain prominent due to the most frequent attacks by Chaos forces. This is made possible by the presence of relatively stable warp exits from the Eye of Terror within them. For the same reason, they are the most fortified and receive the most active military resupply. The Cadian sector perhaps stands as the symbol of the resistance against chaos. It contains the most famous star system near the Eye of Terror, where many heavy battles against chaos have been won. Through this sector lies a path by which one can freely exit the Eye into the rest of Imperial space. Consequently, this entire region has been turned into a fortress. For 10,000 years, the Imperial forces in the sector did not permit madness to break into the Imperium of Man. Although as a result of the last attack by Abaddon, the main stronghold Cadia was destroyed, the sector itself was not completely overrun, and fierce fighting still continues within its bounds. Bellis Corona serves as the central concentration of Imperial Navy forces and also as a reliable rear for the defenders of the Cadian sector. Its orbital spaceports are listed in the von Hef's Gloriam Imperialis as one of the wonders of the Imperium. It is said that the entire battle fleet Obscurus could dock at the expansive orbital shipyards above Bellis Corona. Although the sector itself is somewhat distant from Cadia, it also falls within the Cadian Gate system. During the Crusade, Cadia bore the brunt of the assaults, and the forces of Chaos were not frequent visitors to Bellis Corona. But after the beginning of the 13th Black Crusade, everything changed. Now this sector too finds itself on the front line of the Great War. Speaking of regions adjacent to the Eye of Terror, one cannot fail to mention the Scarus sector. It is the most densely populated of all the sectors surrounding the Warp Storm. There are no fewer than 6 hive worlds within it, unified by trade and military agreements. Each of these worlds has a powerful resource base consisting of numerous mining and agri-worlds. Also within the sector are 2 forge worlds, Nyssa Stolo and MX Prime, which supply the enormous defensive forces of Scarus with the best weaponry in sufficient quantities. All the above allows the inhabitants of the sector to successfully defend their borders, significantly contributing to the containment of the Chaos forces trapped in the Eye of Terror. Another region relying on military power built on an economic foundation is the Agrippina sector. At least that was the case until the 13th Black Crusade. At that time, the sector was a major producer of materials, especially weapons and ammunition for Cadia, and was a key link in the overall defense of the Cadian Gate. Compared to other sectors, Agrippina was a wealthy and prosperous sector, producing countless regiments for the Imperial Guard. To great sorrow, following the tragic events and many associated campaigns, much of the sector now represents a scorched desert. Another vital, though not so well known, region in the defense against the warbands of the Eye of Terror is the Boris Gate, located within the Segmentum Obscurus. These gates represent wormholes leading to stable routes from the Eye, which would allow swift travel to Terra. For 10,000 years, both the Imperium and Chaos have directed their efforts towards the battle for the Cadian sector, rendering this direction secondary. However, even here, the enemies of humanity have repeatedly attempted to break through. Most often, these campaigns involve the Iron Warriors and the Death Guard. Additionally, victory in this region is crucial for the forces of Chaos, because one of the prophecies carried by the Word-Bearers states, "The fall of the Boris Gate will herald the end of times." Therefore, shortly before the 13th Black Crusade, the Dark Council of the Word-Bearers decided to launch a massive assault on the Boris Gate to pave the way for Abaddon's attack. Fortunately, thanks to a coup within the ranks of the Word-Bearers and the intervention of the Necrons, the Imperial defenders, which included the White Consuls and the Grey Knights, managed to hold this vital region. Also of significant importance in the defense of the Imperium, at the edges of the Eye of Terror, are the Seal Sector, the Watch Sector, and the Chinchar Nemesis, Medusa, and Caliban subsectors. Although they are not as active theatres of combat with the forces of Chaos from the Eye of Terror, they still contribute their fair share to the struggle against them. In each of these sectors, a part of space, usually within a radius of 500 light-years from the borders of the Eye, directly interfacing with the storm, is marked by special beacons. From these, warnings are broadcast on all Vox frequencies, indicating that movement further is forbidden. Additionally, in this zone, one can always find an Imperial military presence. This was done not only for defensive purposes, or to protect lost ships from sudden attacks by Chaos forces emerging from warp storms, but also because the Eye of Terror does not have a clear boundary. To properly understand what the edge of this anomaly is like, one needs to imagine the shores of ancient Terran seas. Legends say that in times immemorial, Terra bore the unofficial name Blue Planet, because at that time most of its surface was covered in water, and this water, collected in vast seas under the influence of the moon, would advance and retreat from the shore, sometimes revealing new parts of the land and sometimes covering those already present. This was called tides. Something similar happens with the Eye of Terror. A warp storm, under the influence of unknown forces, can sometimes engulf well-known Imperial systems nearby and release entirely new and uncharted ones elsewhere. These regions of space are prohibited not only from settlement, but also from any visitation purposes, as the newly appeared section of space can be reconsumed by the Eye at any moment. A ship caught there at such a time may at best be thrown off course or trapped in a time vortex, sending it either into the past or the future. Sometimes it may decide to leave the ship forever within the Eye, holding it in suspended animation for all eternity. What can happen in the worst case is well known to the Dark Angels, who experience the tidal forces of the Eye of Terror firsthand during one of their many secret operations involving the hunt for the Fallen. On the twin planets of Casitas 1 and 2, traces of the presence of several traitors from the Dark Angels' ranks were discovered. These planets were close enough to the fringes of the Eye of Terror to be periodically consumed by it, but according to available information, they had not been definitively corrupted by Chaos. Therefore, the summoned Council of the Inner Circle decided to send an operational group on this perilous mission. Aboard the ships setting out on this dangerous expedition were composite companies from several Dark Angel successor chapters. Initially, all went well, and the ship successfully approached planet Casitas 1. Upon landing on the devastated world, the Space Marines discovered traces of some ancient culture worn away by the winds of time. However, on some stones, marks of the ruinous forces of the warp were noticed. Exercising caution, the Unforgiven moved forward, exploring the dreadful landscape. After some time, they came upon a site of a fortress built in the same style as the fortress of Alduk. At the top of the tower, the symbol of the Dark Angel's Legion was visible. It was a Tower of the Fallen. This discovery marked the beginning of the so-called Forgotten Wars. It was decided to conduct a purge of the Chaos-tainted planets to capture as many fallen angels as possible, even though the tide of ruinous powers began and warp storms started to strike the planets. After some time, Supreme Grandmaster Person, commanding the mission, had to give the order for a general retreat. But one of the successor chapters, named the Lion Sables, refused to obey the commander. Then, Person decided to stay with them, allowing the other detachments to retreat. This was the last time anyone saw the Lion Sables in person. The loss of an entire chapter in an instant without a trace is already a great tragedy for the Imperium. But regrettably, human history has an example when the Eye of Terror swallowed up even larger numbers of Astartes chapters. It all began after the ecclesial purges in the year 321 of the 37th millennium. At that time, Saint Basilius the Elder began to gain enormous popularity. Besides a vast number of followers, he also had his own improvised army known as the Purifier Divisions. At the peak of his power, it even included several Space Marine chapters. All these forces were distinguished by their zealousness in exterminating mutants and various types of cultists throughout the solar segmentum. A wave of repression swept through for the eradication of the evil, which had deeply rooted itself in the Imperium. The Ecclesiarchy, the Inquisition, and the Adeptus Astartes united for the first time in a long while. The populace was required to report any suspicions of individuals affiliating with chaos, cults. Sometimes even a carelessly uttered word could become the reason for a denunciation. Under the pretext of this struggle, the population was deprived of their last rights and freedoms. To save time, in some cases it was recommended not to conduct investigations, and therefore less than a day could pass between arrest and the pronouncement of a death sentence. There were also frequent cases when careless investigators ignored the blatant falsity or absurdity of a denunciation, preferring to err on the side of caution and execute individuals just to ensure the suppression of chaos. Ultimately, despite millions of innocent victims, such tactics bore fruit. Instances of rebellion in the solar segmentum fell to almost zero, but unfortunately, the peace built on blood did not last long. The warp entities struck back. The galaxy was hit by a warp storm which was named Dianus. Under its influence, warp rifts began to open up across the Imperium. The number of reports concerning mutation and psychers quadrupled in just one Terran night. But even that was not the most horrifying part. Reports began to emerge that some Space Marine chapters, whose worlds were in the path of the warp storm, faced mass manifestations of mutations and gene seed flaws, previously unknown, which first appeared among the recruits. Naturally, these rumours did not escape the attention of the Ecclesiarchy. The first to take action was Saint Basilius. He demanded that all chapters whose worlds were affected by the storm immediately face judgment. The Elder's influence on the Lords of Terror was so great that his demands were met in less than a year, after which a great trial began, where the accused chapters had to prove their purity and dedication to the Emperor's great cause. They were subjected to severe tests of faith and spirit. The majority of the accused passed all tests honorably and were acquitted. However, about 30 chapters were found guilty. To avoid the disgraceful execution that would so ignominiously end the existence of these glorious warriors, the masters of the condemned chapters proposed sending them on a penitent crusade. This idea appealed to Saint Basilius, and he agreed to the guilty party's proposal, deciding to send them into the Eye of Terror. Although the aim of the campaign undeniably spelled doom for all who decided to embark on it, the gloomy council, which included representatives of all the guilty orders, reached a consensus within a few hours and decided to prepare for the campaign. At the end of the year 321 of the 37th millennium, A somber ceremonial procession passed through the Cadian gates. In one night, the Eye of Terror devoured all those condemned to death. From that moment on, over 30 Space Marine chapters were to be erased from the memory of the Imperium, leaving no trace behind. Less than an hour after entering the warp storm's bounds, whole fleets of perverted chaos ships surged from the gas dust clouds to intercept the invading enemy. Massive battles ensued. The conflict was so fierce that it caused the surrounding space of the warp to churn. A terrible cataclysm erupted, scattering the formidable Imperial armada throughout the Eye of Terror. The warp prepared a unique reception for each chapter. Thus, the Iron Drakes found themselves near the deadly planet Anathra. Upon landing on the surface, the Astartes discovered vast forests of giant mushrooms, the tops of which were crowned with enormous coughing heads, with swollen eyes. Once on the surface, the Space Marines were immediately attacked by these heads. The mushroom heads began spitting grey musk at them. Initially, such attacks posed no threat, as the Astartes' armor excellently protected its wearers from poisons and toxins. But in the most unexpected moment, the warriors of the Emperor were attacked by Plague Space Marines. This changed the course of the battle. A single successful bolt hit, breaching the armor's seal, was enough to make a Space Marine begin to die agonizingly, suffocating from the toxins that entered his body. The infected loyalists tore off their armor and immediately began transforming into similar mushrooms, seeing the wretched fate of their comrades and understanding that the same fate awaited their entire chapter with no help in sight. The remaining Iron Drakes surrendered to the mercy of the victors. Soon, the Imperium learned of the new warriors of Nurgle, calling themselves the Grey Death. The only thing these Chaos devotees now craved was to spread the plague among the stars, the fellow sufferers of the Iron. Drakes from the Sentinels chapter quickly discovered signs of Chaos Space Marine presence on the planet Ernest. Even before encountering the enemy, the Astartes were puzzled by the suspicious consistency of the surface, which was too soft and springy. But only when distant scanning of the nearby mountain range revealed it to be in the shape of a human face did the Space Marines realize that the Daemon World they had attacked was a monstrously obese man, curled into a ball. However, this did not stop the Astartes. Upon discovering goat-headed hedonists frolicking among the hair-like trees on the planet, they began their extermination. The ecstatic death bleating of the mutants was so loud that it drew the attention of the Noise Marines. A brutal battle ensued where bolter shots mingled with volleys from sonic weaponry. The Loyalists fought bravely against superior numbers and would likely have faced heroic death if the sounds of battle had not awakened Ennis. With a mighty hand, he swept those who disturbed his sleep into an esophageal waterfall. When the Sentinels were flung back into reality, they were changed beyond recognition. They had become cannibals, calling themselves the Corpus Brethren. They turned as depraved as the heretics they had been fighting before their demise. Meanwhile, in the void, Gala, the Knights Excelsior, were desperately trying to navigate the incredible natural conditions of the space surrounding them. The first thing they encountered was the maddening jumble of gear-laden dome-toothed factories and spiral staircases clanging around the new arrivals. However, this wind was quickly disrupted when serpent-headed gargoyles, previously seeming inanimate, descended from their pedestals and lunged at the Astartes, spewing fire from the weapons mounted in their jaws. Soon, they were joined by hordes of demonic machines, marching steadily and blazing with otherworldly heat from their foundry anvil. The situation was further complicated by torrents of lava flowing upwards against all physical laws, crashing down upon the heads of the uninvited guests. The Space Marines fought their way back to their ships through heavy resistance. Unbeknownst to them, they had walked into a trap. The moment they boarded, as soon as the shuttles lifted off the ground, the creator of hellish beasts, the warpsmith Valad, revealed himself for the first time, unleashing an electricity-devouring demon. It incited a rebellion among the machine spirits of the warships, which began attacking the Marines inside with static discharges. Fallen warriors were seized one by the piston-clawed devilish Temperaria machines and dragged into the scorching soul forges located in Valad's castle. Later that same year, in the Cadian sector, a new warband of chaos emerged, calling themselves the Magma Hounds. This became yet another calamity for this much-suffering area of space. No less unfortunate was the fate of the Brothers of the Anvil. Landing on the planet Val 4, they decided to explore the ruins of a bygone Eldar empire, but were ambushed by Kabbalists. All surviving Space Marines were captured. For such strong warriors, only one fate awaited them: to be sent to the arenas of Commorragh. After a year of nightmarish trials, broken and not entirely aware of their actions, they managed to escape into the real world, where they began killing everyone in their path. And this is far from all. If we were to describe all the tribulations of the condemned, such works would suffice to fill the great Exeresis library twice over. Each of these stories was as astounding as it was horrifying. One by one, the Orders perished from the perils of the Eye, for the path led them into hell, and from there, as is known, only the most resilient can return unchanged. Unfortunately, only a scant portion of the testimonies reached the 42nd millennium. So little is known about the outcomes of the expedition into the void. The adepts of the Administratum simply deny any connection between the disappearance of several dozen chapters and the subsequent increase in Chaos Space Marine attacks. However, it is definitively known that almost 8 centuries after the beginning of this ill-fated crusade, survivors from some condemned legions returned from the warp. And only after lengthy months of checks for chaos corruption did the Inquisition begin to take seriously the assertion of the Astartes that St. Basilius was a false idol, responsible for the desecration of the honor of innocent chapters and their dispatch into the maw of chaos. By this time, St. Basilius was still alive, so the survivors, led by Konak, chapter master of the Void Swords, descended upon the Elder's palace. Bursting into his lair, the warriors discovered that the ancient saint was in fact an apostle of chaos. When the truth finally emerged, the false saint and his thousands of followers were immediately killed, all his writings and books consigned to the flames, and his temples demolished to the ground. The shameful truth was hastily concealed and forgotten. So, to this day, no one knows the true extent of the damage inflicted on the Imperium by these chaos adherents. However, it was not solely through such tragedies, or the aforementioned Inquisitor Maul's expedition, that the Imperium gained knowledge of the Eye of Terror. Both before and after, thousands of heroes whose names history has already raised ventured into this abyss of madness to gather for the Imperium whatever information they could about the stronghold of humanity's greatest foe. Though most perished or went missing, humanity succeeded in obtaining some fragmented yet crucial information. For example, it was discovered that along the relatively calm and stable warp currents, there exist worlds somewhat suitable for life. This allows certain chaos cult communities to thrive. Thus, the planet Xanadu was discovered. This is a Hellforge world situated deep within the Eye of Terror. It is said to be a great citadel of the Dark Mechanicum. It is believed that this world is utterly devoted to demon machines and infernal industries, where mills grind the flesh of suffering to bring the insane visions of their nightmarish masters to reality. Uncounted millions of slaves labor tirelessly within the labyrinthine network of forges, producing an endless supply of weapons and munitions, arming the legions of traitors for the long war. The masters of Zana, the Dark Mechanicum, resemble half-demons. They long ago cast aside the last vestiges of their humanity, and now conduct their dark researches without regard even for the Chaos Gods. They live by selling or bartering their unholy inventions and weapons to the highest bidder, be it a warlord, demagogue, sorcerer, or demon prince. They exhibit not a trace of altruism, so their currency is always the same: new raw materials, flesh, and the souls of slaves to satiate the endless hunger of Zana too. No less interesting is the world called Ascendant. It is one of the few precious neutral territories within the Eye of Terror. This planet has not joined any of the factions, allowing it to be used for negotiations and trade. Ascendant is famous for its bustling trade, conducted in the markets of arachnotechnology. One can find everything there, from dreams and new sensations, to powerful weapons and raw materials. To protect the wealth amassed on the world, the planet is fortified with hundreds of heavily armed orbital battle stations. They ensure that no external faction can interfere in the ongoing wars that the independent city-states of the planet constantly wage with each other. What can be said in the end? Beginning with the fall of the Eldar, the history of the Eye of Terror has already spanned over 10,000 years, all steeped in the pain and suffering that this wound in the galaxy's body has inflicted not only on humanity, but also on other inhabitants of the Milky Way. As a stronghold of chaos in real space, the Eye will always represent a threat to the Imperium, and as long as this wound yawns, the Imperium will never be able to live peacefully. But now, a ghostly chance has appeared. The great scientist of the Imperium, Belisarius Cawl, has embarked on a long path of research that may ultimately lead him to recreate the ancient Necron technology of pylons, which could potentially seal the yawning Eye of Terror forever.